Today's webinar on First Languages, Education and Reconciliation. Before we get started today, just to make sure that you can all hear loud and clear, it would be great if everyone could press the little hand icon that pops at the bottom of the chat box to let us know that you can hear okay. Perfect, that looks good to go. And if anyone does have any difficulties with sound or with image throughout the webinar, note that this webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be made available to you after the webinar is concluded. And you'll also be able to engage with the troubleshooting guide that I popped into the chat box for you earlier. In getting started for today's webinar, I'd also really like to take the opportunity to acknowledge country and to acknowledge that Kirli and myself are streaming into you from Gadigal country in the Sydney area. And I'd very much like to pay my respects to Gadigal elders and traditional owners of both the past, the present and the future. I think it's really beautiful to think about those elders of the future when we think about the children and students that we're working with in schools and early learning services every day.
Thank you, Steph. I'd also like to echo that acknowledgement of country, pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'm a proud Gunai girl and Woerde, Stevens, Hoskins and Russells from around East Gippsland in Victoria, and then Ewan country, and then on my grandfather's side ties to Gadigal and Gunai country as well. So lots of different East Coast communities mixed in. It's really nice to see some of those communities also represented today with people tuning in from different countries as well. So a shout out to all of you. We've got people from all around Australia joining us, so many different nations, and thank you for sharing the nation that you're on. Really powerful stuff.
Absolutely, and what a day to be speaking about languages. It's a really special day today, not only falling within the International Year of Indigenous Languages, but today is also Harmony Day. It's also National Close the Gap Day. It's the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and it's also World Poetry Day, which is a very special day for Kirli in particular. So we're really excited to bring this webinar to you, to have a conversation with you. Please feel free to share stories and questions in the chat box, and if we don't get through them during the webinar, we'll stick around a little bit at the end of today's webinar too. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to Kirli for joining our Narragunnawali team for today's webinar, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might be streaming into today's webinar as well. I also really like to acknowledge those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have been a huge part of who I am and where I am today as well. My name's Steph. I'm a member of Reconciliation Australia's Narragunnawali team, and languages have a really big place to play in my heart, in that really I feel that my reconciliation in education journey started while working on a First Languages Education and Revitalisation initiative on Mirrawong country. So it's really great to be able to share some of those experiences, but also continue to learn from experiences together with the Narragunnawali team, together with partners like Kirli and the Red Room Poetry team, and with teachers and educators and members of educational communities across Australia like yourselves.
So I'm a teacher. I was primary trained, and I used to work on Dharawal country, so I see a few Dharawal people joining us. Thank you for being with us today. And I'm also a poet and a children's author, and I lead the Poetry in First Languages program for Red Room Poetry. So we're a non-for-profit that aim to make poetry a meaningful part of everyday life by putting poets in the classrooms to engage students. And since our founding, we've engaged over 20,000 students, and since starting Poetry in First Languages in its first year last year, we've engaged over 500 First Nation students and worked in over 10 languages. And this year we'll be leading 35 workshops across Australia, between Northern Territory, New South Wales, ACT and Queensland. So that Poetry in First Languages is just one of the projects led by Red Room Poetry. And yeah, we lead lots of projects around sustainability and ideas of social justice and speaking our truths and using our voice to bring about change in the world. So we've shared a link there to Poetry in First Languages, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more. But in true Red Room Poetry tradition, we'll be starting with a poem. All of our meetings start with poems. And this poem was written yesterday by a student named Grace. We've been leading Poetry in First Languages workshops up on Gunai country and in the Southern Highlands, and with local elders and custodians, Auntie Sharon Halls, Auntie Trish Levitt, and then a Gumi and Dharawal custodian, Jacob Morris. So I'll quickly read one poem for us to get us started. So this is called Yugumba Garal Budan, and it's by Grace. She's in Year 12 at Mosvale High School. Mother Da'ari, glide with your dewey across the Gurad. Yana with me through the Dharambayang, past the Kolo and the Budan. Piala with me about the Bawa, Karat and Kanbi. Speak with me about the Garal Budan. That brings the dewey of the Karat and the Kanbi. We must protect them, says Mother Da'ari. Piala, Nanangula, Gujaga, Yungumba of the Mirren, which means Mother Earth, glide with your dreaming across the ground. Walk with me through the white ghost gums past the koalas and the birds. Talk with me about the bush, the rain and the fire. Speak with me about the black cockatoo bird. That brings the dreaming of the rain and the fire. We must protect them, says Mother Earth. Talk to the people, the small children, and sing of belonging. So that's a little taster for poetry in first languages, which I'll be talking about a little bit more, and just my experience of how teaching language has unfolded for me, working off country and facilitating those kinds of partnerships in different communities.
And a really beautiful reminder from a student voice working with community about the important connection between first languages and country. And I guess in acknowledging country and acknowledging that relationship between language and country, being a member of Reconciliation Australia's Narragunnawali team, it's always really important to revisit the significance of our program name, Narragunnawali, which was gifted to us by the United Ngunnawal Elders Council, in that the United Ngunnawal Elders Council represents the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways on which Reconciliation Australia's head office in the Canberra area is located. Canberra being the nation's capital and the Ngunnawal country being the country on which the Narragunnawali program was first initiated, was a really strong reminder of the importance of remembering that reconciliation and reconciliation in education, as well as across all sectors, is very much a national journey, but there's a real importance about thinking and acting locally at the same time. The word Narragunnawali actually encapsulates words such as alive, well-being, coming together and peace. There's no perfect English translation for the word Narragunnawali, but essentially it brings with it many of those key connotations that we think about when we think about the concept of reconciliation. It reminds us that reconciliation is something that needs to be alive. It's something that we need to be actively working on in a very everyday and embedded way. And if we can do that, that can generate a really important sense of well-being, coming together and peace. So throughout today's webinar, we're going to start by having a bit of a high-level look at what is it when we talk about that language of reconciliation generally. Where do first languages come into the context and concept of reconciliation in education? And then Kirli and I are going to share how a bit of our respective work can help to support you in thinking about first languages initiatives in your schools or early learning communities, and most importantly in your relationships with your local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. We will remind you as well that this webinar and those that are streaming into this webinar from lots of different places and spaces might be involved in some difficult conversations today. We'll be looking at some of the injustices and the truths of colonial Australia's relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their languages, but this is very much a safe space, and so you're very welcome to ask questions and share stories with us at any time, and also take the moment to stop and reflect if you need to pause on some of the webinar learnings today too.
Yeah, at Red Room Poetry, we enact our Safer Spaces policy as well. So we can't guarantee that a space is always safe, but we do our best to try and create that safer space where open conversation is accessible. And if this raises anything for you that you need to talk about afterwards, please reach out to Steph or I at Red Room Poetry or at Narragunnawali with Reconciliation Australia, because we'd love to be able to support you with that. And with the notion that, yeah, reconciliation and healing intergenerational traumas of our past is a very long and ongoing journey. And I think as teachers, we're at the coalface of that all the time. You know, I taught 30 students over the last 2 days on country, and most of the conversations around identity evolved out of those conversations of these are the reasons we don't know who we are or where we come from, and it's okay that we don't, and this is how we're going to find out, and it's going to be a journey that's tricky, and we'll hold your hand and walk you through that. So hopefully today we can provide you with some of those skills to equip you with those conversations with your students, and maybe to provide you yourself with different strategies to unpack all of that. Yeah,
absolutely. So today, obviously, the focus of our webinar is to think about the place of first languages in our reconciliation journey. But to take a bit of a step back, it's worth having a little bit of a think about the language of reconciliation more generally and what it is that we're really talking about when it comes to reconciliation. In that we very much understand that reconciliation is a very diversely understood word. It's a word that means many different things to many different people, and in some ways it can be considered quite a contestable word in that it does imply an initial conciliation or friendship, whereas when we think about the truths of colonial Australia's relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, what we know is that in reality these have been largely characterised by forced dispossession of traditional lands, separation from families and speaker communities, and often very overt and unapologetic racism. So it really begs the question of how can we have reconciliation in Australia if we perhaps never had conciliation or true conciliation to begin with? And these are the kind of questions that a lot of Australia is still grappling with today. In 2016, though, drawing on both national and international research and models of reconciliation, Reconciliation in Australia launched quite a landmark report called the State of Reconciliation in Australia report. And the reason why this report was quite significant is that it was the first of its kind to provide a shared and digestible language around reconciliation, drawing on these diverse meanings and measures to find what reconciliation really meant at its core and how we can measure where we're currently at in our reconciliation journey, as well as how far we have to go. And what the report found is that at its core, reconciliation is comprised of 5 integral and interrelated dimensions. And those are the dimensions that you'll see on the screen in front of you right now. In no particular order, one of those is around race relations, and it's important to preface that when we're talking about race here, we're talking about it as a socio-cultural construct rather than a biological reality. But we're also doing so with an understanding that the experience of racism is still very real and rife in Australia today. So essentially, this dimension is about driving stronger relationships of mutual trust and respect between the wider Australian community and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Often key to those relationships too is a focus on both equality and equity and understanding both the relationship and the distinction between the two. So at the high level, we can think about that as being, for example, the relationship and yet distinction between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But if we think about students and children in our schools and early learning services every day, it's essentially about understanding the relationship and yet difference between sameness and fairness. So sometimes treating everybody the same doesn't necessarily mean that we're treating everybody fairly. So this dimension is really about balancing those different components and ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have the opportunities to participate in a range of life experiences, all the while ensuring that the unique rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are respected and recognised and upheld.
Steph, can I add to that part?
Absolutely.
So our experience of running poetry in first languages has been one of trying to iron out issues of access because the program is supported by state and government funding and different individual grants as well from different organisations in the arts and in humanitarian aids. There's been a real sort of push for us to provide the program for free. And so all of our students can access the program without a cost to their school, but we found that we had to really work with teachers to provide them their permission notes so that they, teachers, you're all very busy people. I know, having been one, we're flat out. We don't have time to make our own notes sometimes. So, things like providing notes meant that access was more equally accessible for those students, those First Nation students who needed it. Sometimes calling parents in place of just, sending home the permission note, providing buses, providing catering for the workshops. And so if you're planning an event at school for your First Nation students or to support your First Nation students in engaging those access things, that extra care is really, really important. And I think it falls under that race relations banner of this reconciliation report. Yeah. And I'm sure these are things you already know, but small reminders can go a long way when we're super busy.
Definitely. And it's important to think about those little things in the context of everyday work, because we all know as teachers and educators that it's easy to be caught up in the everyday rigmarole, and yet it's important not to lose sight of the things that are important, even if they may seem small in the context of our work too, because often those little things actually make a significant and big difference. In looking at the centre of this screen, we can see the unity dimension, and this is essentially about all Australians really recognising and celebrating not only the tens of thousands of years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures that have preceded colonisation and that continue to be such a rich part of Australian society to this day, but also finding a way to actively celebrate our shared national identity and generate a sense of shared national pride as well. When it comes to institutional integrity, this is really about having an active support of reconciliation across the nation's political, business and community structures. And we can think about schools and early learning services as institutions in their own right, and institutions that unfortunately for a very long time, and sometimes we're still grappling with the effects of this to this day, have done a real disservice in terms of accommodating not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but also their cultures and their languages in the classroom, for example. And so often there's a lot of undoing to be done in this institutional space too. Which brings us to the historical acceptance dimension as well, which is really about all Australians honestly and holistically understanding the impacts of the wrongs of the past and the often intergenerational impacts of these wrongs, in that only if we can truthfully do this can we really right these wrongs and ensure that they're never repeated into the future. For many of us as teachers and educators, that often involves processes of our own ongoing learning, and in fact often ongoing unlearning and relearning too, to start to grapple with how some of the things that we might have learned in our own school experience might have only been presented from a single perspective, or might have even been presented from a falsified perspective. So it's about not only continuing through our professional development to learn more, but to also critically reflect on what we've learnt, how we learnt it, why we learnt it, and see whether there might be ways of looking at it from a new perspective, particularly through conversations and collaborations with your local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
Yeah, I think those are probably my favourite parts of the workshops that we lead with students on country, is the conversation, and it's a very real conversation with elders and custodians, where they sit down and they'll unpack, like me, our family histories, and we'll say, you know, we'll recount stories of living on missions, or our parents being raised as part of the stolen generation in children's homes, and be very real and raw with those elements with our First Nations students. We work solely with First Nations students for the program at the moment. And then with Reconciliation New South Wales to expand that project towards all students for access. But I think those very real conversations mean that students get to understand, our First Nations students get to understand what has happened in their family history. That means that they might not be able to identify with a strong cultural connection, or a strong connection to country, or a strong connection to language. And for the students who aren't a First Nations background, then they get to see the realities of why there are gaps in that pride in cultural identity. And then we go from there with our First Nations kids into an exploration of how our identity has been told to us. And then, do we agree with the cultural and social constructs, or the historical constructs that have enabled that story of identity to be portrayed? And if that doesn't feel true to us, if that's not our truth, then where do we identify with culture, and where are we strong and proud? And we found that connecting to the earth has been a really, really strong way for our young people to feel really confident and really proud during workshops. And so we'll take them out on country, we'll sit them with a tree, we'll work with them by the river, we'll work with them in gardens, and they get to, I think that innate flow with the earth, that innate connection to the land that's beneath us and that has always been there to hold us, really flows from those moments, and students were more confident to write and talk about their experiences. So that would be one tip I have: bring in some elders and custodians, have them be real, provide that safe place, and then provide the safe place for the unpacking afterwards, because so often we go on this emotional roller coaster. We hear these stories, these very true and very necessary and raw stories, but then we might not always have the time to unpack later. And the unpacking can take a day, a week, a month, a year. It could be an ongoing thing for the student that you've got in your classroom. So just being really mindful of that, and, reaching out sometimes, hey, how you going? We were thinking of getting auntie, and again, would that be helpful for you? And they might say, yes, please. And that small little tidbit, a little hand extended out, could be really helpful. Yeah,
for sure. And again, all of those little things come together in important ways. And so when looking at these dimensions, it's really important to think about the fact that they're very much seen as interrelated. You can't have one without the other. And in fact, they all influence each other in reciprocal ways. And so we could really say that the state of reconciliation in Australia, or in fact, the state of reconciliation in any given school or early learning service community, is only ever going to be as strong as its weakest dimension. In looking at that historical acceptance dimension, it's worth now taking a little bit of a look at what is actually the context of first languages in Australia. Where have we come from? Where are we at? And where would we like to go in terms of the place of first languages in our reconciliation journey and in individual journeys across the country as well? It's important to recognise that at the time of colonial arrival in Australia, more than 250 distinct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages were spoken in Australia. So these are, again, distinct languages, not dialects. There were many, many more dialects, and they're all very much connected to their own geocultural communities as well. We can see a beautiful quote here shared by Miss Amelia Turner, and it really reminds us that languages are powerful. Languages are connected to a sense of self and self-esteem. They're connected to a sense of country and place. They're connected to a sense of culture, and they're definitely connected to kinship and family and community as well. And so keeping these languages living, not only in our memories, but also in practice wherever we can, is a really important part of our reconciliation journey. And sometimes that means teaching about languages if we don't have the immediate possibility to teach these languages. But it's about recognising their ongoing and active significance, no matter what the context is right now. In recognising the state of first languages in Australia at the time of colonisation, it's also unfortunately important to recognise that a range of colonial injustices, varying from not only forced dispossession of children from their families and speaker communities, but also explicit condemnation of first languages use in precisely the kinds of institutions like schools, has severely affected the ability for first languages to continue into the future. And it's important to recognise that currently, if we look at the latest National Indigenous Languages Survey report data in 2014, it was found that only a handful, about 17 of these languages, are considered strong in the sense of having been able to be passed down from the grandparental to the grandchild generation. And so in thinking about approaching first languages initiatives as part of our reconciliation journey, it's also important to understand the context of these journeys and to understand what the impacts and the very intergenerational impacts of colonisation has been on the state of first languages in Australia today.
And I think that awareness step also extends to, you know, sometimes we're asking an elder or custodian into our classroom and they might not be willing to share language because they, for example, in my family might have been raised on missions. And so, you know, you were reprimanded for speaking language on a mission, and it's still in the back of my mind, you know, having an elder talk to me about how, oh, you know, I can't teach language, not only because I don't know a lot of it now because we weren't allowed to speak it when we were children, but also because I was always in trouble if I spoke it. I don't know if it's still safe to do that. And so, yeah, having that awareness in your classroom just means that you're approaching everything with a cultural responsibility and a cultural respect. And I think being really real with children about that is important too. You know, the community that I live in, we have elders who identify country as Alara, Darawal, or Wadi. And so, you know, and they contest each other about which language we're speaking. And so, you know, I'm just walking country there. And so whenever I do my acknowledgement, I always acknowledge all three languages because I'm not the person to say that a language is or isn't the most important one. And I think I have very honest conversations with my students about that reality too, so that they know that this is the context of language in our community, and the context of language in all of the communities that you live on will be very, very different.
For sure, and I think, as Kirli said, children actually understand these honest conversations too. Sometimes it's easy to forget how well children actually understand the importance of telling the truth, of sharing, of fairness, of kindness and friendship. And so it is important to nurture their understandings around those kind of concepts as we talk about the context of first languages in your local community and across Australia. And remember that, as Kirli said, there are not only cultural considerations, but a whole range of social and emotional considerations that come into place when it comes to first languages programming and initiatives. Which brings us into a bit of a look into how first languages can play out in the reconciliation process, but also what some of those considerations might be. And so while colonisation and past policies of assimilation have severely affected the practice and continuation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, it's also really exciting to recognise the work that's been done in Australia and across the globe to maintain or revitalise and revive these languages. And these are very challenging and often long-term processes, but there are some really exciting illustrations of work where a language that was once classified as extinct has actually come back into the vocabulary of the speaker community too. And so where it's possible, those language maintenance and revival and revitalisation processes can be really important acts of reconciliation. And what they do is they first of all take that historical acceptance dimension and recognise what the impacts of colonisation have done to these languages over time. But the research also shows that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who can speak their first languages are more likely to attend school, gain a post-school qualification and be employed, have markedly better physical and mental health, and with that are also less likely to engage in at-risk activities. And so first languages revitalisation activities can also be a really important way of fueling a sense of not only self and self-esteem, which is going to ultimately help with those educational engagement and achievement opportunities, but in so doing also help us to tackle some of those big questions around fostering equality and equity and closing the gap, so to speak. Today being National Closing the Gap Day, it's important to think about where languages come into that picture as well. And this really rings true in terms of my own experiences working on a First Languages Revitalisation initiative on Mirralum country in the Kununurra area, in that we went from a context of only a handful of fully fluent speakers being able to speak the language to now more than 400 children being able to learn that language every week through a full immersion program. And notwithstanding many challenges, what we really found is that the program grew quite organically because not only were teachers seeing that this was strengthening children's language development, both first language development, but also English language development, what it was really doing almost just as significantly was promoting a stronger sense of self and self-identity and self-esteem for the local Aboriginal students. But what it was doing alongside that was also generating a stronger sense of intercultural awareness, empathy and respect to really encourage all students and children to feel excited, feel comfortable, feel confident and feel competent in their learning environments to then achieve to their fullest potential too.
Steph, we're having poetry in first languages. We had it evaluated last year by Bailey and Yang Group. So they're a large research body, and they found that 95% of the participants who engaged in poetry in first languages, this was their first access to language learning. And this project was run in New South Wales, and then this year we're in New South Wales, Northern Territory, ACT and Queensland. And so the program this year is being evaluated by UTS, a master's student there, Eleanor Carlis, and both of these research projects have been around the impact of wellbeing, and overall there has been every workshop, anecdotally I can say that I see kids go from that sort of shame when they walk in and feeling really uncertain about what they're going to explore, and walking out with language under their belt, the confidence to read a poem in language, and just the pride that they have within themselves. They float out of the classroom, they don't walk. And yeah, in the weeks that follow, I hear the different things that they do with their teachers to celebrate the language that they've learnt, and you can see that it really does impact their cultural identity. But beyond that, an elder was talking to me about the way that language plays into wellbeing, and they said that, if we use words to describe our identity, if we use words to think, then having language, words to think and to describe our identity gives us new language to unpack parts of ourselves that we haven't been able to access in English. And I think if that is your only reason for teaching language, then that's a really beautiful one, that, our kids would be able to find new words to talk about or talk to themselves, and that hopefully those give them that strength and pride to feel better, to feel greater, to be able to know that they can achieve really wonderful things in this lifetime. Yeah.
And that's huge. And I think in thinking about the importance of languages generally, it's also worth kind of pointing out that we are having a whole year of celebrating that significance this year, having the year being announced as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which is a really great way to build momentum behind understanding the place of first languages, not only in Australia, but across the world, but also to remember that an appreciation of this significance and an active attention to this significance should continue not only throughout the year but into the future. And I think the United Nations approach to the International Year of Indigenous Languages has been seeing Indigenous languages as connected to a number of different key elements in everyday life, such as knowledge, peace, rights, inclusion and diversity. And we see under that peace piece that that's where reconciliation is really identified as being part of that process. But of course, again, these are all very much interrelated too. Touching on what Kirli's introduced us to as well is thinking though about when we do bring first languages into the classroom or around the school or with the community, what are some of the things that we need to think through and reflect on and communicate and consult and collaborate with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on before we actually go into any active processes. And I'd encourage you to think about some of these considerations as opportunities as much as challenges. That they do sometimes present as challenges, but there's so many learnings that can come through that process that will mean that the result afterwards will only be so much stronger. So as we've kind of already introduced, recognising the current endangerment status of so many of Australia's first languages is really important, because as well as understanding whether or not there's actual immediate potential for a language-related initiative to pan out, it's also important to recognise that in approaching a local elder or traditional owner, it could be quite an insensitive expectation to suggest that he or she necessarily has the immediate opportunity to share with you.
And I think a safe way to ask that question could be, you know, I'm a part of our Northern Illawarra AECG at home, and we're working with AECGs across the state to meet with them and just say, who is the most appropriate person for us to contact if we were looking for a language custodian, and seeking guidance from your local AECG. If you don't have an AECG in your area, the next best thing would be to see if your school already has a connection with a local custodian. If that's the case, then I would be going to them and just saying, we're really interested in embedding language into our learning at school. Do you know of any local language custodians that we'd be able to work with who would be really effective in teaching in the classroom? And that way, that gives them the free space. If they're not the person who would be most suitable, if they don't feel confident to teach language, they might know somebody who is. And if they don't, you can say, well, do you know anybody who I might be able to talk about this? Also, your local lands councils are really helpful. Your local council could be really helpful. And there's also lots of resources on the Reconciliation Australia website as well.
Yeah, and we'll share a few of those with you soon. And remember that it's also okay to teach about languages if there's not an immediate opportunity to teach language, in that sometimes, regardless of the status of a language, there might also be really distinct cultural protocols around who has the responsibility or the authority to use a language, to learn a language or teach a language, and with who they can do that, or when, where and how. And that these protocols will be so diverse across different communities, and so it's really, again, important to have those conversations first, in that, for example, in my own experience, it was more than okay for non-Indigenous students to learn the local language, provided it was being taught on Mirralung country and at least in collaboration with a Mirralung elder. Again, if you move to a neighbouring community or a community in another part of Australia, the protocols might be quite different again. But essentially, to ensure that your programming and your learning and your teaching around languages are as relevant and respectful and responsive as possible, it's really important to be aware of not just the context or the status of that language, but also whether there might be any cultural considerations around its teaching or the ability to have that language learnt too.
And so we sometimes when we're teaching, we'll work with custodians who very strictly only want to work with First Nation students, or on the opposite, sometimes some teachers or custodians would like to work with the broad range of students, and we respect both of those choices. I think having the awareness and the understanding that some of our elders or custodians would only like to work with First Nation students comes from a place of wanting to make sure that the knowledge that has been missed, that has skipped a generation, is given back to those students, and that they have that access to something that they should rightfully have access to. So I think it comes from a protective heart space, and sometimes I know my experience in teaching could have been thinking along the lines of, well, that's really frustrating because our whole student body would really benefit from this. But I think our whole student body also really benefits from our First Nation students feeling really confident and proud, and overall our community feels really, really, you know, is strengthened by having that connection as well. Yeah,
for sure. And so take your local community's guidance on what is respectful. I think we often have questions around, you know, how can I make sure that I'm carrying out respectful practice, or how do I ensure that I'm not risking offending or doing something tokenistically? And that's where your community can really guide you along the way, and take the time to have those conversations and those reflections first.
I think the best phrase I received as guidance in that was "nothing for us without us." Yeah, so if you right now nothing else from this webinar, write down that one, "nothing for us without us." Make sure you're consulting with your community, and it's easy to, they call it perhaps elder shopping or custodian shopping. You know, you just go to one person without going and exploring the broad range of custodians available to you. And you know, even I've made that mistake. So yeah, I would really encourage you to reach out to your AECG, have a really broad conversation, and you might hit roadblocks, but knowing that, you know, and when I do, I call my mum, "Mum, I've hit a roadblock, what do I do?" And she always tells me, "Girls, this has never been about you, this is about kids, you know, make sure you call the next person, or go and get that next person's approval, or go and get that next person's respect and their endorsement and their blessing to do this, because you can't move forward without that. And if you can't move forward, then find out why you can't move forward with it, and make sure that you really take time to sit with the reality of why you can't move forward with that just yet, and then it will become available to you." So yeah, hopefully that helps.
And that question of why should always be there too, because it's the why that will give us the meaning in the work that we're doing. And as Kirli said, we often say the same when it comes to reconciliation. It's not something that's done to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It should be done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's when we know that we can work through the conversations and the collaborations to figure out what makes the most sense for a particular local context and what will be the most sustainable and significant into the future. As Kirli mentioned too, sometimes there's also no perfect translatability between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages in English, and that's another important consideration. Sometimes you'll see words in English that are absent from an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander language, and reciprocally, sometimes you'll see words in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages where there's really no equivalent in English, and those are the kinds of words that are so significant when it comes to a sense of being able to express your sense of self or your unique life world as well. And so when it comes to teaching, it's important to think about the fact that there's not always going to be a direct translation or an opportunity to write a sentence in a first language word for word as an English sentence would be. And so take the time to digest that a little bit as well.
Yeah, and that's something we experience a lot when we deliver this program, Poetry in First Languages, particularly on the East Coast, where we've been, struck quite hard with colonisation. There has been a lot of language lost. Most of our poems are written with fragmented English and another language, be that Gunai, Darawal, whichever language we're working in, to embed throughout. And so, exploring that idea and that concept that this is the reason why we don't have access to full language with students, I think also gives them a little bit of peace of mind, particularly our First Nations kids, because I think there's a lot of guilt and shame associated with not knowing language or not knowing those parts of your cultural knowledge that you feel you should, and then having the awareness that this is why can help for them sometimes on their journey with their identity.
Yeah, and thinking about, this webinar is very much focused on first languages, but also those new languages that have emerged since colonisation, whether it be a language in its own right, such as a Creole language, which can have a really strong place in sense of ownership and identity for students and their communities as well, or diverse dialects such as Aboriginal English as well, and really remembering that all of these kinds of languages come from a place, come from a context, and are associated with where people have come from, where we've come from, where we're at today, and that they're also important to recognise too, because language is expression of yourself and of the meanings that you're making of the world, and so every language should really be recognised in its own right too. To support you through some of this thinking and these processes, I'm just going to whiz through a couple of the resources that are available on Reconciliation Australia's Narragunnawali platform, which has been designed specifically for schools and early learning services to support them to bring reconciliation not only in the classroom but also around the school and with the community. And for some schools and early learning services, this is done in a formal way through the development of what's known as a Reconciliation Action Plan. And I've just popped a little link into the chat box about what a RAP is and and how it works as a framework for really holistic and whole school change. As part of that process, or also outside of that process, you can access on our platform one of our suggested RAP actions, which is totally centred on the idea of teaching about or teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. For every single one of our RAP action pages like this, you'll see a bit of an overview, which will cover some of that foundational background into what the action's actually about. You'll also see some need to know text, which will present some of those key questions, some of the questions that we've discussed today, and also other questions that you might be reflecting on right now, and to think about what is it that I need to know before I approach something in practice. You'll also see some suggested ideas for action. So these are kind of like actions within an action or sub-actions. They're a short list of non-prescriptive or non-exhaustive ideas for how you can start to, in a step-by-step way, address this action in practice. And then you'll see a range of professional learning and curriculum resources that have been tagged against that action too. And so you're very welcome to explore them. All of these resources are free to access following a simple sign-up and login process, and you can flexibly engage with them depending on your particular local context and its needs or aspirations, and you're very welcome to kind of adopt and adapt them in the ways that make the most sense too.
With regard to our RAP stuff, because we've just implemented one in our workplace, I found that we harnessed on what we were already doing in our organisation, and just focused on the ways that we could start where we already were, and then, you know, embed that into our RAP. So it's definitely something workable. I know that when you first open one, it can feel sometimes a little bit overwhelming, and you might feel like, well, this was my experience, oh gosh, are we going to be doing enough to enact reconciliation in our organisation? And so I know that schools are already doing really wonderful things. So it's starting on what is that really wonderful thing that you're already doing, and just enhancing that and making it more authentic, more community-based, and with that idea of, you know, with community, bringing community into your classroom and having them along for the journey. Yeah, having them drive the journey really within the school.
Absolutely. And to support you in kind of thinking around how do we actually evaluate what we're doing and whether it's good, have we had those conversations with community, what have come out of those conversations? An example of one of the professional learning resources on our platform tied to this action around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages is precisely about evaluating the resources that we're thinking about putting into practice, and thinking about, you know, where has this resource been produced? What's the context of its production? But now what's also the context of its use in the classroom? Is it useful within our particular local Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community? Is it meaningful? Is it culturally appropriate? Because what represents best practice somewhere is not necessarily the same elsewhere, and in fact could even risk being inappropriate practice. And so it's really important to evaluate resources both ourselves and then in our relationships and conversations with community too.
I was working with Ani Faye Muir down on Bunwurrung country, so hello to our Bunwurrung members joining us today. And Ani Faye was saying to me that because there were around, you know, there were all of these different languages and, you know, European languages arriving in Australia, that also influenced the way that the Bunwurrung nation was named, that the title of the nation, even just the title of the nation, the sound and the iteration of the name of that nation had been, has so many different names, and that all of them are correct. And so even having that awareness that, you know, the pronunciation of the different names of the languages, or the sounds of the words, or the different streams of language that you hear is really helpful, and particularly when you're working with an elder or custodian, because you will come to see that different elders and custodians might have different languages, and even on Dharawal country where I live, there's 10 different dialects, and so, you know, all of the different languages, elders and custodians that we work with might have access to different language, and having that awareness has been really helpful, that, you know, not one of them is more correct than another, but that is the context of what we're teaching in our classroom. Yeah. And so that has also helped me then to evaluate resources when I've been picking up a new thing. You know, should I talk to this elder about this, or this elder about this, or should I talk to both and see if this is the right thing? And then, yeah, the AECG has been really helpful in making those kinds of decisions too. So that could be another organisation you reach out to if you get stuck.
Yeah, because a resource itself is never inherently meaningful without a context. And so if we don't know the context of where it's come from or the context in which we'd like to use it, we can't really evaluate the extent to which it might be relevant or responsive or respectful, or that it might risk being tokenistic or offensive. And so having that awareness of context will really help you to make the decisions about whether to use a resource in the first place, and if so, how you're going to do so. Just another little snippet into some of the attachments that often come alongside our professional learning resources. We do have a bit of an evaluating resources guide, which can be accessed via the evaluating resources languages professional learning activity that I've popped into the chat box. You can also access an actual languages resource guide, which is a bit of a structured overview of some of the range of kinds of resources available to you, all the while remembering that these aren't prescriptive and they're not exhaustive, and that you'll need to have those conversations and those reflective evaluations before you put them into practice. When it then comes to putting things into practice with students and children, we also have a range of curriculum resources that are tagged to that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages RAP action. So for every RAP action, there'll be at least one early learning, at least one primary, and at least one secondary resource, where we've drawn on relationships with respected partners across Australia to look at what kinds of resources can operate at the national scale, but also have the opportunity to be localised and contextualised within diverse educational communities. And each of these curriculum resources are also aligned to national curriculum frameworks, so the Early Years Learning Framework or My Time, Our Place framework in the early years or outside of school hours setting, but also the national curriculum in the school setting. And similarly, the professional learning resources are all aligned to the S8s or professional standards for teachers, so it can help you in your ongoing professional learning practice as part of your everyday expectations. I'd really like to press pause for a moment and play you a bit of a video from Red Room Poetry's Poetry in First Languages initiative, which Kirli has been coordinating for some time now and has achieved some incredible results from. So it's really exciting to be sitting next to Kirli today. I'm going to pop on a short film and then we'll pop off our camera and our microphone for a moment before I then hand over to Kirli to share with you some stories and some learnings and some information about opportunities for you to maybe get involved in the Poetry in First Languages initiative, or to think about how you might be able to take some of the learnings from the initiative into your own work.
So the film that we're about to watch was shot on Dharawal country. This Poetry in First Languages iteration was led with First Nation students and also students of refugee and migrant backgrounds. And the reason that we brought these two communities together was that there was conflict within schools around these two student groups, and we wanted them to see that both cultures had been displaced. And that, you know, these students were united in their dispossession of language and culture and story, and that hopefully we could find some kind of reconciliation within this community. So you'll see a mix of both of those student groups, and they'll talk a little bit about their work together. Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm going to pop the video on now. If you do experience any difficulties with seeing or hearing the film over the next couple of minutes, I'll also pop a link into the chat box as to where you can access it online, either after today's webinar or in another time of your own. And then we'll come back together in just a couple of moments.
Hi, my name's Kirli Saunders. I'm a proud Gunai woman with ties to the Yuin, Gadigal, Gundungurra and Biripi people, and I'm the leader of the Poetry in First Languages project, run and delivered by Red Room Poetry. You know, we're all starting our language journey together, walking that path hand in hand, and then for the students who aren't of First Nations backgrounds, it means that they get to see this journey and know that displacement that they feel is not just theirs to feel alone. We've been delivering these workshops on Gundungurra country and today on Dharawal country, and it's just beautiful to see these kids interacting with their custodians and elders and learning language, writing poems, creating art, and now turning them into dances as well.
To see the kids' faces when they actually start at the beginning of the day thinking they can't write poetry, let alone write poetry in language, and then coming out with a piece of poetry that is polished and has language in it and has meaning behind it for them individually. That's the gratitude I get from the project.
We've been learning about how words from Aboriginal and then what they mean in English.
These kids need to know who their elders are out in community. We're able to help them if if they need us, and it's very important to have elders in their lives. It's about keeping our culture alive and passing down that knowledge to our next generation and our kids.
The Woerde is as smooth and luscious as a puff of cloud. It is calm and peaceful like a peaceful mander. The water is as crystal clear as a diamond.
And it seems as though the children are loving learning about country, learning about language, and really just having something to identify with. Absolute confidence building. The kids are in the classroom, they're having fun, they're engaging with each other. You know, some of the shy kids, we're seeing strengths in them that they weren't showing before the workshops.
I think it's important to see this project rolled out in every single First Nations community across the whole of Australia, solely because on every single community there's a different language, and within every language needs to be that empowerment for students to carry that language, to have that connection to their cultural identity and to walk that journey with one another.
And I hope you really enjoyed that film as a bit of a illustration of practice of what's possible on the ground. In thinking about that on the ground context, we've had a really great question from Sherry in the chat box around this question of language mapping, and there's a range of different map resources that are being created by different bodies across the country. And in fact, if we, I'll pop into the chat box our languages resource guide, which has a section on the diverse kinds of mapping resources that are out there. And it's important to recognise, and the IATSIS map of Indigenous Australia mentions the same, is that these map resources are designed to be a guide only. The boundaries are not intended to be necessarily exact, in that precisely as Kirli said, and particularly when compared to the colonial map of Australia, sometimes these boundaries are a little bit contested, they're quite complex, and where the exact lines lie can be a little bit ambiguous at times, and that's where those conversations with communities and diverse members within communities can be really important. So in any kind of map, and it's quite nice to actually compare them with each other, it's worth kind of not only acknowledging the diversity of languages across Australia, but also the diversity of representation of those languages through a mapping resource like that, and remembering to kind of acknowledge that while the map gives a really good high-level representation of that diversity, it's not necessarily intended to be perfectly precise. And so that's where conversations with real people in real places will guide you into knowing what country you're standing on, or whether there might actually be some questions or the complexities in knowing which country you're standing on and which languages belong to that place too.
And I think too, you know, with the knowledge that in one nation, I mean, Steph pointed out that there's 250 different languages, but there are 650 to 700 different dialects.
Exactly.
So within one nation, there could be 10 dialects or more. And having conversations with students around language maps is always really helpful to raise that, you know, originally these spaces were outlined by boundaries, and those boundaries were sacred places. They were landscapes, there were rivers and mountains, escarpments, you know, shorelines. Having those chats with kids, and then talking about the ways that our songlines play into, you know, the connections of different nations, and that, you know, languages, one person in one nation might learn 5 different languages to be able to communicate with the 5 different nations that surround that group for trade and marriage and things like that, or just for migration, for moving. All of those things are really good stories, good conversations to have with your students, and to open up their minds to the diversity of language.
Yeah, so many learnings to come out of not just the languages themselves, but all of these kinds of thinking and visuals around them. And a visual that I really like as well is comparing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander map of Australia to, for example, a map of Europe, in that often the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander map of Australia blows people's minds. But if we think about the fact that, you know, the map of Europe can actually fit really comfortably within Australia, it's a very kind of similar way of thinking about the fact that when we move between places, we have different physical environments, we have different language environments, we have different cultural environments that come with that, in the same way that if you cross the border between Holland and Germany, you've got a unique culture and you've got a unique language once again. And so
songs, dance stories, totems, yeah, all of that.
Absolutely. And thanks, Steve, for sharing your feedback too about the fantastic film. And it really is fantastic work that Kirli and the team at Red Room Poetry are doing. And so I'm going to let her share a little bit about that with you now.
Okay, so poetry in first languages, I think I mentioned, was born on the banks of the Shoalhaven River. I could hear the sounds of ancestors singing and I wanted to know what they were saying. So I called my auntie and she said, it's time for you to learn language. And I said, okay, well, if I want to learn language as a poet, how can I support other poets to learn language? And so one arm of poetry in first languages is the commissioning of First Nations poets to work with elders and custodians to write poems in language. And from there, we'll be creating an anthology next year that includes all of those poems and links to the curriculum so that students can access First Nations poetry in a meaningful way in the classroom. Another part will be taking First Nations poets commissioned poems, and then also students' poems, teachers' poems, and elder poems, and working with the Australian Association of Teachers of English to have curriculum-aligned activities on cards that roll straight into the classroom, and teachers can use those to be able to access language. So that's what we're working towards in 2020, as well as these workshops. So those are two kind of arms of poetry in first languages. Another part of poetry in first languages is the teaching of workshops. So this year we're teaching 35 workshops across the eastern seaboard, and next year we'll be moving across the nation. And I believe the intention is to have a resource for every single language group, 650 different dialects, and all of our resources are tailored for the nation that we're working for the country that we're working on, with the elders and custodians that we're working with, and the Indigenous intellectual cultural properties are maintained for all of our elders and custodians. And that's a really important part of working with elders. It means that their knowledge and their wisdom that they share is respectfully just borrowed. We're just working with them, and that they are 100% acknowledged as being the source of that. And I think when you are bringing people into your classroom, if you're sharing things on that an elder or a custodian has said, that you really need to pay attention to the ICIP. You really need to make sure that they are always acknowledged for having shared that knowledge. And, you know, with the awareness that they're speaking that knowledge, but it could be from their family, from their mob for hundreds of years. So that's what the ICIP talks to, and we'll talk a little bit more to that in a moment. You can see the objectives of the program were to explore the ways that language shapes identity. So the program is being researched by Bailey and Yang and also by UTS, and really sought to unpack shame and promote pride. And I think that's a big part of our program, is sitting with our young people, talking about who we are, where we come from, why we can't necessarily identify our mob, our family, or the ties to different nations that we have, what's happened in our family's history, what's happened in our nation's history, and then where are we now and how do we move forward from here, and what does it mean to sit within our own identity and not just the identity that's been told to us externally. Because I think First Nations identity has been painted to us in curriculum for a long time. I remember being a kid in the 90s and having you know, pictures of the noble savage and being told that Aboriginal people wore lap and carried spears, and when I saw something different, like my mum running her own business in town, I was always very conflicted and didn't really understand it. So unpacking those parts are a really important element of poetry in first languages workshops. We also support and engage a range of elders, language custodians, and poets, First Nation poets and artists. So in 2018, we employed 24 First Nations people in our organisation. Our organisation usually has 6 people. It's grown to 8 people now, and to employ that many First Nations people as part of this program, and you know, all of our other programs also employ different poets as well. But that was a really exciting part for me, to provide those employment pathways, and they're ongoing, which means that now that we've made connections between custodians and classrooms, those classrooms will continue to bring that custodian back into their space. And that element of loyalty to our custodians and elders is really important. We publish the poems. All students write poems in the classroom with these elders and custodians, and they're about country, they're about identity, and then we publish them on the Red Room Poetry website. So I started the workshop this morning with one of the students' poems from our recent workshops on Gunai country. Yeah, so I spoke a little bit to the outlook. You can see what the program will look like over 3 years. And after that, we want to create resources that teachers will be able to access in the classroom, so that they can just bring in a custodian to provide professional development. And that way you'll be equipped to go and teach those resources, teach that language within your classroom with their support, but always with custodians first. So we might go to the next page. So this is what 2019 looks like for us. We just led our workshops on Gunai country, which was lovely. We were working to conserve the black cockatoo, the glossy black cockatoo, with the Office of Environment and Heritage and Wingecarriby Shire Council. So we spent our time, we started with the smoking ceremony. We did some workshop with Auntie Sharon Halls, Auntie Trish Levitt and Jacob Morris. Auntie Sharon and Auntie Trish are Gunai custodians, and Jacob is a Gumia Darawal custodian. And so we worked with them, and then we also worked with Simon and Lauren from the Office of Environment and Heritage, and we planted she oaks to try and bring the glossy black cockatoo back on country. And we really focused on the idea of custodianship and care for country. And then we came in for the following days to write poems about that custodianship and our role in caring for country. And we drew on Auntie Trish's guidance for language words, so Gunai language, to be embedded in those poems. Students will perform those poems at NAIDOC ceremonies, which is really exciting, and their poems are getting turned into artwork for the NAIDOC art exhibition as well, so that'll be fun. The Darawal workshops are going to happen on May 7 and 8, and we've got a range of different schools being involved in there. Those workshops in the Illawarra. We're also having one on Darawal country up towards Campbelltown as well later in the year. These programs will see us work with other local arts organisations, local elders and custodians, to bring poems together so that students can write poems and then turn them into artwork. So where possible, we try to take poetry to be just one access of self-expression, but we want to see students turn their poems into dance or into art, into some kind of physical and expressive iteration of their thoughts and ideas in language. And I think that ties back to our traditional ways of knowing and being too. You know, dance is a way of expressing ourselves. Song have been a way of expressing ourselves for time immemorial. So that continuation of poetry into those things and the echoing of song lines in our poetry, I think that's really important. On Bunjalung country last year, we worked with a diversionary centre, and this year we're going to be working with local public schools. So we're going to be working with the AECG up in the Northern Rivers, and I really encourage you to reach out to your local AECG and make a really strong connection, have a chat with your elders and custodians, get their guidance. I'm often working off country. You know, these programs are happening in New South Wales, Northern Territory, Queensland and ACT, and often out of my own community. So I approach that with the same in the same way that lots of our non-First Nations teachers or even our First Nations teachers working off country would, which is reach out to community where accessible and have a chat with them, a really honest chat, and seek their guidance. I don't go to them and say, this is what I'm doing. I say, this is what I would like to do. How can I do it right? And I always look to them to be the voice of reason. Yugambeh country will be up in Queensland, really excited for those. Aranda will be around Alice Springs, and we're working with a playwright and myself for those workshops. Gumia Darawal will be down the banks of the Shoalhaven again with Budget on Trust, and then Barkinji around Broken Hill and Menindee. So if you're in any of those areas, super excited to work with you. For the Bunjalung and the Barkinji and the Ngunnawal workshops, which I think are on the next page. Yeah, we'll be working with local artists. So the poems will be published in into the waterway as a soundscape. And if you place a stick into the water and into your ear, you'll be able to hear the sounds of the poems flowing through the water. So our artist, he's not First Nations, Alan Giddy, but he works really closely with Maori and First Nations communities. And that'll be a really lovely extension of the program that engages the community. And that's the kind of other element to poetry in First Languages, is making language accessible through the arts so that the broader community can access that. And when you're working in your classroom, I really encourage you to take what you're working on and extend that out into the community in a culturally responsible and respectful way with your custodians. Just let them know that this is what you'd like to do so that we can celebrate and share language, because there are things that they might not only teach to First Nations students, and there are things that they'd be happy to share with the broader community. So having that awareness. For Gadigal workshops, we'll be working with the Royal Botanical Gardens and with NASCA. So where possible, we try and partner with organisations who will help us bring our dream alive. And if your school is interested and you're already in one of those areas and you might like to participate, please get in touch.
Yeah, and there's been a couple of questions in the chat box about not only kind of joining existing opportunities, but scoping out additional opportunities. And we'll share with you at the end of this webinar some contact details for Kirli and the Red Room Poetry team. And you're very welcome to get in touch to explore those opportunities into the future too, and find out a little bit more.
So questions around how do we choose schools? Sometimes or partner organisations that we're working with will identify a school that they would like to work with. We try and aim for schools with lower socioeconomic status who might not have the access originally to these kinds of programs. And then we also have schools who will contact us directly and say, we'd like one of these workshops. We'd like to also work with 3 other local schools. Can we make it happen? So if that's something that's available to you, then that's totally a possibility. This year's schedule is mostly filled up, but next year we're open to having those conversations. So if it's something you'd like to be involved in, please let me know. And particularly around South Australia, Western Australia, we haven't got our plans yet for 2020, but that's in our scope. We'd like to make it to those areas.
Really exciting.
Thank you. So this is a workshop example of what's involved in our resource. So this is the story of Naora, the black cockatoo from Jacob Morris. So he's and Joel Dees. So and Adrian Webster, these were the custodians that we worked with for these dreaming stories. So the boys sat down, they told me the dreaming story, and then I said, this is a really beautiful story. How can we embed it in a Yuin dialect in Gunai Darawal? And they've shared this with us. So you can see down the bottom on the right-hand side there, there's the Indigenous intellectual cultural property of the Yuin Marin translated into Gunai Darawal by, and then there's the 3 custodians, Jacob Morris, Joel Dees, and Adrian Webster. So that is a part of our resource that we embed all the time, because we think it's really important that the Indigenous intellectual cultural property is maintained in our resources, and we don't share these beyond the workshop that we're working with. So you're very privileged to see these today, and it'd be great if you didn't take photos of them. Thank you. Here's another example. This is what our language dictionary looks like, and you can see that there's a copyright for Ani Trish Levitt and the Indigenous intellectual cultural property belonging to the Levitt clan of the Gunai peoples. So we think it's really important, like I said, that there is that copyright pertaining to the person who's provided it to us. Like walking on country, it's not ours. Like sharing language, this isn't mine. I just feel really privileged to provide a space to be able to allow access to our students. Yeah. So here's an example of the kind of workshop activities that we do. So we talk about, and this exercise has been extended into this year into more of a dreaming exercise. So we'll talk about the dreaming, what it means for our students, and then we'll get them to be really, really present, go and sit with a tree, go and sit by the river and write a poem or a poem fragment or a ramble where they can reconnect to the country and therefore reconnect to themselves. And then we go and embed those poetic techniques. So for most of our students, we find poetry to be a really freeing medium to work with, because you know, it means that our students don't have to feel limited by their literacy skills if literacy isn't a strength of theirs, and you know, that the reality is that we've closed the gap. There is a gap in educational outcomes for our First Nation students, and quite often when we're working with some of our students, they are a little bit behind in literacy. So this is an instant way of saying, yes, you're excellent, you can write really wonderful things, you don't have to write in a structure here, I don't even care what your spelling's like, give me your meaning, what does it feel like to be connected to country? And of course that's not always the case. Yeah, thank you. The next slide has what I've learned. So this has been a very steep learning journey for me, even as a First Nations person. I believe that everywhere I go, every opportunity I have to work with community, I'm always learning something new. So I think we've really had a good chat today about understanding the cultural, political and historical contexts of your community. So everywhere that you go to teach language or that you want to access language, you will be restricted by this cultural, political and historical contexts that your school exists within. So it's really, and you know, you might say, how do I find out about that? Well, I would Google your local area, find out if there were massacres in your local area, find out if people were moved to your local area because of missions, or if they were plucked from your local area and taken to a mission somewhere else. Find out, have a chat with your local AECG, local custodians about any recent race relations. You know, sometimes they will amalgamate multiple schools into one area, and that brings with it lots of a melting pot of all different kinds of cultures and languages, and then that brings its own political sphere. Have a look at the political contexts of the school system now and the place that we're working in. What did that look like 10 years ago, and how does that impact the way that your custodians or elders will come to work with you? So having that awareness means that you know the best ways to move forward. Consult really widely. You know, sometimes they will call it elder shopping, where you will just go and find one elder that will serve the purposes that you need to work with. It's really irresponsible. It's not culturally respectful to take just one person as the, you know, the truth, or being the person who can provide the absolute answer within your community, because our communities are so diverse, and really taking the time to reach out to multiple community and consulting widely will be of benefit to you in your classroom, regardless of where you are. Connect to land councils, councillors, AECG, Aboriginal education teams. You know, within the departments there's Aboriginal education teams. Have a look on their websites, jump on the Reconciliation Council Australia's websites. Can contact your local AECG, contact state AECG, and really upskill yourself so that you have knowledge around these different spheres and the best ways to embed all of this knowledge within your classroom. Be really loyal, you know, taking that time to sit down with an elder or a custodian, have a cup of tea and chat to them about how they're going, and thank them so much for coming into your classroom, and inviting them back year after year after year after year is really powerful. It makes them feel really, really respected and loved, and that they're valued for sharing their knowledge and wisdom in your classroom. And it also acknowledges the strength that it takes to be able to get into the classroom when schools haven't always been safe places for our people. Celebrate culture as an underpinning for all programs. It's not good enough to just celebrate culture for NAIDOC Week or Reconciliation Week. These have to be things that underpin every single element of your curriculum and of your school year. Work with your school community so that you can alter that culture of your educational community. You know, the space has to look like it is a culturally safe space. It has to feel like it is a culturally safe space. It has to sound like a culturally safe space. And that's not just for First Nations culture, that's for all cultures. And I think schools are beginning to do a really, really great job of making sure that our schools are culturally safe spaces. Work with your 8 Ways Learning framework. They've updated it recently, so jump on the internet, have a Google, and the 8 Ways Learning framework will come up. I found that to be really helpful when I was teaching. Record your learning in a range of ways as aligned to that 8 Ways framework. You know, and particularly for our students, if they're struggling with one element of self-expression, perhaps in literacy or writing, then giving them a different way to share their response, providing that extra wait time, those things are really important, and they're tiny adjustments to your teaching that make a big difference. Listen more than you speak. This one has been, it's really hard for me to have a webinar where I can't hear you back. This has been a really important part of my learning as a young person growing up in a First Nations community. You know, we taught some kids this week, and one of the other custodians said to me, gosh, if I talked more than I listened, my grandma would have clipped me up the ear. And I was like, oh, me too. So it's nice to, you know, to take the time to listen and be really active in your listening, not just waiting to get the answer that you need, but really, really hearing what our people are saying. And then again, nothing for us without us, making sure that you engage your local community in every way possible, and that you ask in a safe way, you know, do you know a language custodian who could be helpful for this, because I'd like to embed this in the classroom, is safer than do you speak language? So it's just having those really mindful things, rather than, you know, are you an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person? Do you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Might be a safer way. Or do your children identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Might be a safe way to go into a PLP conversation with your kids. Yeah.
Absolutely. Kirli, thank you so much for not only joining us throughout today's webinar, but for your friendship over time, and for leaving us with some really, really key learnings and messaging that I think we can all take with us into our everyday work into the future. Thank you also to everybody that stayed with us a little bit over time today, and for those that might have had to head off outside of their lunch break or outside of the teaching hour that they had covered for the hour but not quite more. We hope that you can enjoy the last bit of this webinar once the recording comes through within about 24 hours. Kirli and I are going to switch off our camera and microphone in a moment, but we will stick around in case there's any last questions in the chat box. We might share a few resources with you too that you can take into your classrooms and around your schools or early learning services and with your community. And we'll also share our contact details too. But thank you so much. It really means a lot to both of us to see the energy and enthusiasm and commitment to driving reconciliation in education and thinking about about the place of first languages in that process. I'm going to share with you as we finish off and turn off our camera and microphone a short video as well, which reminds us about that importance of building relationships with community, and share some really honest reflections from teachers and educators about how they've gone about that process. And we'll actually see a bit of an illustration of practice from Pulteney Grammar School in South Australia, who has worked with Jack Buckskin to develop a language initiative in their school. And so it's really nice to kind of think about not only what's happening across the country, but how we might be able to critically reflect on that and work with our own local communities to do the best job that we can in this space. So thank you all so much once again for joining us today, and thank you, Kirli, for sitting by my side and walking on this journey with us. I think as we continue to have these conversations, we'd love for you to stay in touch with us all, because we learn so much from yourselves as teachers and educators and members of educational communities on the ground. And in thinking about those conversations moving forward, one of the things that I'll share with you as well, in fact, I might pop the link into the chat box right now, is our recently launched National Reconciliation Week theme, which is all about reconciliation being grounded in truth and walking together with courage. So thinking about how it's those race relationships that are significant to our journey into the future, but how they need to be based on and grounded in really truthful conversations and reflections. And we can think about in talking where first languages come into the picture as well. Yeah. Thank you so much once again. We'll say goodbye for now, but we'll stick around for a moment and look forward to keeping in touch into the weeks and months and years ahead. Thanks, everyone.
Please email if you have any questions. We'd love to be able to help out.
Thanks again.
There are a lot of Aboriginal people in your local community. What a lot of schools do is they'll make contact with one, and then the following year it's somebody else coming in. So then it's not a familiar face. Nobody can actually build a bigger and better relationship. It's the constant contact year after year that people get more comfortable with.
We've cut this off nearly 2 years ago, and see, the tree hasn't died. It's still alive. It doesn't harm the tree at all.
Would this stop a spear, do you think?
Our Gunai shield scar tree is not far from us in the parklands. Jack Buckskin very kindly came and cut it for the school to see and use. So it is to be in classrooms, handled by the children, and visiting the scar tree as a great point of discussion.
We have a club in our hand and a shield in our hand.
The scar is one of the most significant things. For us, the shield was an object made to be broken, so it would never last a long time. The scar is one thing that lasts forever. As long as the tree's there, the scar stays there. So I thought I'll try and find a tree close by in case the teachers wanted to incorporate it into their studies.
Having community members come in and assist the schools, it might be parents, it might be elders of the community, might be someone like myself. To have them come in, those kids are then going to be able to understand that Aboriginal people are people and that we live a lot like others today, instead of having us as this thing of the past.
So we went out into the wild and we collected 8 different reeds and rushes of Boandik country. It's our role to make sure that we can teach the next generation. Tap into some of your local elders and encourage them to come along. I often bump into some of the students down the street or in town or out in the country. So we've now got a connection. They've got a lot of respect for some of the stories that I've been telling them. Just lovely to be able to think that we've got people coming on, learning about our culture.
The thing that's important for services to consider and to understand when they're connecting with our community is that the first thing that educators will ask when they meet an Aboriginal person from their community is, we need this, can you do that? Instead of it just being a relationship, it's about having a cup of tea without the expectation that you are needing or wanting something in return.
Bring in community, bring in elders. Make it more a close thing, like someone that knows somebody that might be able to bring somebody in and talk to them and listen.
What I try to leave with people is that this culture of ours, of Aboriginal people, is the culture of Australia. And now that you are a part of it, you have obligations, as we do, to sustain and maintain this culture and this country. So I try to make people feel more inclusive and that they have an obligation now to look after this country alongside us, not against us.